There's a lot of fear and discussion surrounding immigrants and refugees right now, which some may feel justified based on their perception of the current circumstances. But let's take a minute to look back on the history of the fear of immigrants and refugees in America.
In the 1750s, Benjamin Franklin warned that German immigrants were too stupid to learn English, and therefore the preservation of the English language was at risk if German numbers increased. And yet hundreds of thousands of Germans became the backbone of agriculture in the Midwest, settling in Texas and the Dakotas. In fact, Germans popularized the idea of decorating a tree at Christmas or painting eggs at Easter, and those are still fun things we do now.
In the 1840s and 50s, the Know Nothing Party came about as an anti-immigration force against Irish Catholics because they had a huge fear of the Catholic Church. They literally thought they were controlled by the Pope and would destroy America's Republican values. Americans, afraid of Christians.
In the 1870s and 80s, at the same time that the Statue of Liberty is being used to show freedom, independence, and the end of slavery, the Chinese Exclusion Act is created, which inhibits all immigration of Chinese laborers. Animosity towards the Chinese began in the post-Civil War economic decline, with many politicians blaming the Chinese for depressed wage levels. Ironically, many of the negative voices were Irish immigrants who just decades before had been discriminated against as well.
Again, in the late 19th century, fears of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe arise because they're coming from anarchist and communist communities, and Americans worry that this will undermine a democratic society and its institutions. Because of this, new quota laws are passed stopping immigration from some countries.
During World War II, Japanese immigrants and their American-born kids were put into internment camps because there was a fear that they were spies or conspiring against the government. But later they found out that none of this was true, and in fact it was mostly just based on racism. 62% of the internees were actually American citizens, and it was just fear that created a harsh discrimination that affected generations to come.
At this same time, many other immigrants were suspected to be spies as well, and as a result, those who were fleeing the Nazis were turned away and denied protection. Anti-Semitic sentiments even caused America, Cuba, and Canada to turn away the SS St. Louis that was carrying nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees. Nearly 1/4 of them would later die in death camps during World War II.
In the 1980s, large numbers of Cubans started to immigrate to America, but there was actually a serious, genuine concern that coming from a communist country, they would be unable to understand democracy. Even Cubans who had come generations earlier, prior to Cuba becoming communist, were worried about these new Cubans coming in, and they thought that it would undermine the work that they had done in America.
You see, there's often the fear that immigrants are too culturally different to intermix into our societies, or that they're gonna steal your jobs, or that they cause a national security threat, but these things have been said about every major immigrant group, and in fact when we look at history, we see that the opposite is true. Now people are saying, but Mitch, they don't even speak English. Well, neither did most immigrants hundreds of years ago. In fact, the founding documents were also published in German to accommodate those populations, and in most of the 19th century, public schools across the entire country used languages other than English. And it took several generations for communities to use predominantly English.
It's history repeating itself. The more often that we can look back and see how unfounded our fears were, the more clearly we can put today's concerns about refugees or immigrants into perspective. For example, since September 11th, no one in America has been killed in a terrorist attack by anyone who emigrated from, or whose parents emigrated from, any of the countries that are currently being banned from coming to America.
There's no evidence that any refugees since 2001 have caused any acts of terror in the United States. There are 5 million Syrians in Turkish refugee camps, 2.8 million in Lebanon, 650,000 in Jordan, 230,000 in Iraq, and 116,000 in Egypt. And currently the US government will stop accepting Syrian refugees indefinitely, all while decreasing the number of visas for refugees worldwide in half to only 50,000 in 2017.
And since the September 11th attacks, 230,000 people in America have been killed by someone. But only 123 have been killed by Muslim terrorists. The rest were killed by their spouses, gang members, drunk driving, psychopaths. This means that the current executive order is trying to address 0.05% of the lethal violence issue in America.
And the actual number of refugees who have become extremists in the United States is estimated between 3 and 12 out of the more than 800,000 refugees that have come since September 11th.
So before you let the fear of the media or the fear of the unknown affect you too much, just remember we've been through this before. We can learn from history.
By changing our collective attitudes, we can literally save thousands of lives of people who just want a safe and welcoming place to live. Something that every human deserves. Be that welcoming force in the world.